At all times, tracks, trail and highways served humanity as keys to evolution. Empires and civilizations disappeared, centuries-old dust swept capitals and cities. However, roads kept on breathing life back into them. Do we really understand how roads revitalized areas hundreds of years ago and how they affect people's destinies today? We go on the Treasures of the Nation expedition to reveal facts about life at the crossroads of antiquity. Modern motorways are very much new. Nevertheless, if a trail is left, it will surely be found even thousands of years later. How did they lay to rest in different epochs? Who is actually buried in the Juchi Khan mausoleum? How modern computer technologies can help to bring ancient people back to life? Burial is communication with culture. Frequently, it is even the only source of knowledge about the past. We study life through death, and thus today we're launching a unique project. Science will allow us to see with our own eyes what our ancestors looked like hundreds and thousands of years ago. As archaeologists, we are always dealing with artifacts, that is, the remains of material activity, so to speak. But many people are interested in the appearance of those people who did those things and lived in the distant past. The method of plastic skull-based facial reconstruction helps us to achieve this. Soviet anthropologist Mikhail Mikhailovich Gerasimov developed it during the last century. Mikhail Gerasimov had tested his method for the first time in forensics. He restored faces based on skulls of unknown skeletons of his contemporaries. Such reconstructions allowed the law enforcement multiple times to identify the remains of dead people. The laboratory of plastic reconstruction established by Gerasimov is quite active even today. Many archaeologists go there to produce busts based on recovered skulls. At present, virtually all forensic specialists undergo training based on Gerasimov's method. His lab is basically the place where they start their career. Firstly, we have collected the so-called craniological materials, that is, skulls. They came from all over Kazakhstan, all its regions. How many in total? 35 skulls corresponding to different eras, starting from the Bronze Age up to the 16th century BC, that is, the Nogais of western Kazakhstan. Male and female? Yes, both men's and women's skulls, and even two married couples. We know that because we found them in Bronze Age graves where men's and women's bodies were buried in the same place. Is anybody in the world doing something similar? No, not exactly the same, of course. The majority of efforts target sculptural reconstruction. We did plaster castings, and now they do it using special plastic. In the West, they use silicones and other more modern materials. But nobody has ever tried to bring them to life. We're the first ones to try to do this. By the end of the episode, we will not only learn what our ancestors looked like, but will also revitalize them by means of modern computer animation. It will be a truly unique tele-reincarnation. Let's allow the scientists and designers to get busy with their task of bringing people back from the other world, so to say. In the meantime, the Treasures of the Nation expedition will go in the other direction. Life is but a huge road, inevitably leading us to the other world. How did our ancestors lay their fellow people to rest? What are the differences among the burial ceremonies of different eras? And what features remain the same up to our days? To discover that, the expedition team is embarking on a journey along the paths of the afterlife. Burials of the Bronze Era speak of highly organized burial ceremonies followed by our ancient ancestors. Let's learn in detail how they used to bury people in the Great Steppe 3,500 years ago. Igor Alexeyevich, it's a beautiful place. Where are we? We are in Shet district of Karaganda region, specifically in Karajartas burial ground. Does it belong to the Bronze Age? Indeed, it is a Bronze Era monument. Based on the radiocarbon tests that we conducted, we can claim that this burial ground appeared in the 15th, 14th centuries BC. Karaja burial ground is interesting because it has the central structure probably belonging to a high-ranking person and smaller burials presumably belonging to lower status or common members of society. The overall structure of the mausoleum is also rather curious and represents a stepped pyramid built of specially selected and processed flat stone slabs. The mausoleum includes 5 rows of walls and a massive cubic-shaped central structure. Along its perimeter, the mausoleum is tiled with large plates characteristic of the so-called Begazi-Dandebaev culture. The construction of the mausoleum required 800 times more time, efforts and materials compared to the burial of a common community member, which means that the person buried here was quite a big shot in the times, a king or a prince of some kind. Well, all this proves that the Begazi-Dandebaev society of the late Bronze Age can be qualified as highly organized and centralized, possessing rather extensive human resources. Respectively, they already knew how to process bronze and traveled in chariots, that is, were quite technologically advanced for the time. Most certainly, wheeled vehicles were already quite widespread in the area. Their large achievement was horseback riding. What do you think about the reasons why those people chose exactly such structure and shape for their burials? What were the ideas behind building the grave exactly like that? A person was believed to hold the same status in the afterlife as he or she did in this world. So the burial ceremonies and structures, or whatever burial designs, would highlight his or her status. In the grave, they used to put whatever a given person owned during his lifetime. So they would put the dead in the grave in his or her clothes and decorations. In this case, we see that the dead person had bronze ankle beads and lamellar bracelets with helicoid ends and wrists. In addition to jewelry, Bronze Age burials often have ceramic vessels with doleful foods. The dead were thoroughly supplied for their journey and life in the other world with everything necessary. Whereas the Bronze-era grave of an ordinary person may contain 1 or 2 such vessels, a large-scale burial structure may contain dozens of them. That emphasizes the leader status of the buried, that is, his or her place in both our and the other world. We can identify the contents of such vessels by taking and testing the samples of carbon deposits from their inside walls. Most often archaeologists note that it were vegetable or milk-based foods. Occasionally we find sheep and goat bones in these vessels too, which makes us sufficiently confident that they also used to load such clay vessels with pieces of meat. Protruding bones or large joint bones, or R6 as they are widely known, represent another rather interesting find of the Bronze Age. We all know these sheep bones used for games and fortune-telling. The majority of such finds correspond to children's graves, which probably points to their being used for kids' entertainment. Surprisingly, one of such sheep bones discovered by archaeologists in a burial was gilded. Does this mean that they put it in the grave for the person to play in the afterlife? Hard to say, but it was included in the funeral accessories. 4,000 years have passed, but the tradition is still here. Our children are playing the same games as the children of our ancestors used to do. The millennium-long continuity of the culture of the Great Steppes since the Bronze Age manifests itself not only in the objects associated with children's games. It appears that the graves of married women besides jewelry include headpieces completely covering their hair. The graves of younger-age women and presumably not yet married contain braid jewelry in the form of bronze beads interwoven into hair. There was basically no headdress and the girl's hair was open. Archaeologists link this phenomenon to the wedding ceremony still observed by the Kazakhs in relation to the bride. After the wedding, they remove the open headdress and replace it with a scarf completely hiding the newlywed's hair, because it is considered inappropriate for a married woman to demonstrate her hair to strangers. The fact and the evidence that we find in the graves, proving that this modern ethnographic tradition was observed already in the Bronze Age, is merely astonishing. The evident cultural continuity of the ancient Great Steppe is not the only reason for fascination. The shape of Karaja Tas mausoleum itself is similar to that of Egyptian and even Central American pyramids. Is it by accident? The concept of the pyramid here might have been borrowed. Even if so, then perhaps there was some kind of trans-Asiatic corridor connecting the Middle East and Central Asia. In other words, there was some kind of road. Yes, not only migration flows went back and forth, but also ideas, things, technologies, including construction canons. And this exchange probably went in both directions, inwards and outwards. Mutual influence. Yes, this is proved by the fact, for example, that the combat chariot, the chariot that was used for military purposes, that was invented in the Ural-Kazakhstan steppes, appeared in the countries of the Middle East, Egypt, the Balkan Peninsula, much later compared to when it was first registered here. There was a lot of mutual influence. Is there continuity of subsequent eras with the Saka age, for example? Yes, absolutely. This era kind of laid ground for transition to a higher level of development. The early state formations of Saka, Scythians and Sarmatians appear exactly during this time. What about the burial structures and ceremonies? Well, in the early Iron Age, they change, although the above-ground burials of outstanding members of society also remain. That is the terrestrial burial chamber with a barrow above it. The main installation was superimposed by a barrow. So its external appearance would be no different from the Saka ones. No, on the outside it was a usual barrow, but its internal design would be different. Meanwhile, the Gerasimov's lab, where the skulls of different eras found in Kazakhstan were referred to for reconstruction, produced some preliminary sketches of ancient people who lived in our territory. 3 computer models got into the final shortlist out of 35 total. One of them of a representative of the so-called Alakul culture of the Bronze Age, exactly the time when mausoleums like Karaja Tas were under construction. The second one of a representative of Tasmala culture of the early Iron Age, a contemporary of our Golden Man. And the last, but not the least, the closest to us in time, a medieval Kipchak nomad. The whole project team was anxious to see what the owners of these skulls looked like during their lifetime. The designers started to process the received images and data, building a framework out of contour lines, filling the volume, adding facial features, etc. It was all almost like magic. Although in real life it is all about very much scrupulous and complicated procedures backed with cutting-edge technologies taking several weeks. Whilst the images of our ancestors are starting to rise from ashes, the expedition continues its investigation of the non-existence. Archaeologist Igor Kukushkin told us that the appearance of Saka burials is practically the same with the burials of the previous Bronze Age, that is, traditional barrow-like mounds. The magnificent finds of that period perfectly demonstrate their contents. But what about the burials of our earlier ancestors? How did the eternal dwelling of the dead begin to transform during the days when the outlook of life of those people itself started to change? Karaganda region can boast of several unique ancient mausoleums, beautifully showcasing the times of change. A Zhezkazgan archaeologist, Arman Bermagambetov, agreed to accompany us to the mausoleums, starting with the earliest funeral complex, the Mausoleum of Dambaul. Okay, Arman, we are now in Dambaul Mausoleum. It dates back to the 9th century. Stone construction, square in shape. From distance, it reminds of a usual nomadic yurt, which means that certain construction and dwelling traditions were observed for building the houses of the dead too. Monuments similar to Dambaul are rather frequent and are called dins or kara dins. In Kazakhstan, the widely known and steeped in history mausoleum of Koza Kopesh and Bayan Sulu has a similar structure. Dombaul is surrounded by a whole necropolis, which includes monuments starting from the 9th and going up to the 19th century. Place where the most ancient barrow burials, the adobe mausoleums of the 18th, 19th centuries, and the so-called tot kulaks, typical Kazakh burials of the early 20th century, can be found next to each other. So they would bury their dead exactly here. Yes, up to the present time. Absolutely right. Some of the mounds little further out date back to the early Iron Age. In general, this territory was inhabited by people since very ancient times. Scientists are still arguing about the actual purpose of the Dombaul monument. The very first research conducted by Alkay Margolan proved that the site contained no graves, and thus the complex was constructed and used for cult ceremonies. It is a pre-Muslim monument in the area, so it may be that they performed ceremonies related to Tengriism, change of seasons, or maybe sacrifices. In other words, it was some kind of open-air steppe temple. Yes, quite possibly. Well, in addition, it served the function of a reference point in the steppe in order for travelers not to lose their way and die in bad weather. In winter or at night, they could spend some time here and then continue their way after the weather calmed down. So a traveler could actually spend a night or two close to such a cemetery or any other burial site, and it was considered normal. Yes, you're quite right. In general, the steppe people did not view burials in mausoleums as something repellent or scary. People could come here, perform rites, and as necessary, of course, spend a night or some time hiding from bad weather. Can we say that the architecture of purely cult and funeral sites like the Kozy Korpesh burial ground that you mentioned before corresponded with each other? Yes, their architecture is very similar. This barrow looks like a transitional one, like a barrow which wants to become a mausoleum, so to speak. Well, figuratively speaking, yes, you're right to a certain extent. The structure gives us a clear understanding of its design, the overall architectural plan, if I may. The beams are still visible, so there was a wooden ceiling covered with cane. The cane then was covered with clay, and it all went like that to the very top. In the upper part of the dome there was an opening, like Shanin rock. To some extent, yes, it was the tradition. In the center here, they could make a fire. As I mentioned earlier, there was no burial here, and it was possible to come here, make a fire, get warm, drink some tea or eat some meat, in keeping with the best traditions. Steppe traditions, you mean? Yes, I imagine it was quite comfortable inside, and it might be considered a sacred place too. Yes, they could perform various cult activities associated with steppe traditions. Sacrifices. Do they still use this place for similar ceremonies today? Yes, many guests come here. Pilgrims? Pilgrims also, and they make sacrifices here. Praying? Absolutely. So the ancient successive spiritual chain is still here. Naturally, it was never broken. Following the paths of the other world, from the monument of the early Middle Ages, the expedition team was bound to a later burial site, the mausoleum of Joly Khan. Well, we have arrived at the mausoleum of Joly Khan. The mausoleum follows the portal and dome style characteristic of the so-called Golden Horde period. A large counter-arch, a U-shaped niche initially decorated with glazed tile containing abstracts from the Quran. When was it built? They dated back to the time of the death of the Joly Khan, that is the 13th century. Nevertheless, judging by its architectural style, I tend to consider it a much later structure. I personally date it back to the 15th century. So initially there was some other structure and then they built an additional one. I personally think that in the beginning it was a grave in the form of a burial barrow, over which later on they built the mausoleum. The mausoleum itself is Muslim in style. It has the portal and the dome, as you've rightly noticed. However, it is well known that Joly Khan was not a Muslim himself. So our conclusion is quite possible. The legendary archaeologist Alkay Margulan was the first one to investigate the mausoleum of Joly Khan in 1946. He and his team explored the burial and described in detail everything that was discovered here, including the remains of the wooden stretcher that they most likely used to bring the dead to the place, and the head of either a horse or a camel close to the buried. This way or another, a Muslim grave could not contain this set of funeral objects. So, can we say that the person that was buried here was in fact buried in accordance with his steppe customs? Yes, not Muslim. No, not Muslim. The Muslim-style mausoleum was erected on top of the barrow later on. His descendants, who as we know were the preceding Kazakh Khans, built it. Why do you think they would build a more modern building, say in the 15th century, over the earlier grave? The matter is that by building this monument, the Kazakh Khans wanted to demonstrate their belonging to the Chingizid kin. Some researchers of the 19th century also testified to it. They wrote that Kazakhs who had already accepted Islam built mausoleums over graves of their non-Muslim ancestors. So in the 18th and 17th centuries, or even slightly earlier, the transition from ancient Tengris burial customs to new Muslim ones began. In general, the distribution of Islam is a kind of a separate subject, as it took place in different regions of Kazakhstan differently. Whereas in the south, Islam can be traced back to the 9th or 10th centuries, in the north it developed somewhat later. Historical facts demonstrate that in some regions of Kazakhstan in the 19th and even in the early 20th century, many Kazakhs had not yet accepted Islam. Therefore, a considerable area of most ancient traditions and ceremonies of the Great Steppe that have survived among the Kazakhs up to our time have nothing to do with Islam. Well, one may say that these burials kind of symbolize the gradual transition from ancient Tengrian to new Islamic traditions. Yes, roughly speaking, it is possible to say so. Can we have a look inside? Yes, of course. Let me tell you a little bit about its architecture. The arches that you can see in the corners are very special. Their purpose was to bring this square shape into a circle. By means of these architectural method, ancient architects transformed the square mausoleum into an octagon and then into a hexadecagon, or a 16-sided polygon. And following the same way, they would eventually arrive at this circle-shaped dome summiting the building. Besides that, the arches were also intended for uniform distribution of the dome's weight on all four walls of the structure. There are similar buildings in southern Kazakhstan. To some extent, the mausoleum can be compared to another one located not far from Taraz. I mean the mausoleum of Baba Ja Khatun. I'm sure you have been there and seen it. Of course. In principle, they are very similar in size and shape, as well as stylistically. So there was some influence from the south, most certainly, and this is historically confirmed by the spreading of Islam. In general, how typical this kind of funeral architecture is for this area? Or is this one the only monument of the kind? There are several mausoleums here. The mausoleum of Allah Shah Khan, for example, is very much symbolical for the history of Kazakhstan. Can we go there? Yes, of course, if the road allows it. Let's roll. The legend of Allah Shah Khan exists in many Turkic peoples. Certain scientists allege that exactly Allah Shah Khan was the one to unite the Kazakhs. Others claim him to be a mythical character, the primogenitor of all Turkic peoples in general. In any case, this stone at the entrance to the mausoleum depicts the tamgas of all Kazakh Juzes and tribes, which testifies to the unifying role of this legendary ruler. However, the question about who's actually buried in this mausoleum is still open. Personally, I'm inclined to think that Allah Shah Khan was just another name of Haknazar Khan, who lived in the 16th century and was the son of Qasim Khan, who is known for uniting the Kazakh kins. And Haknazar was the one to finish this process. The burial itself is rather similar to Juche Mausoleum. Are they of the same time? This one is later, of course. The monument is remarkable because of its well-trimmed decor. It looks very artistic. Here, for example, you can see the famous Karege yurts. Right. So there is a clean linkage with nomadic life. No doubt. Absolutely. Okay, how is this specific monument different from similar ones of the period? Well, it has the so-called roundabout gallery, which no other similar buildings on the territory of Kazakhstan have. The gallery is inside the wall. And so a person rising using this gallery kind of circles the whole mausoleum building. Can we climb there now? Yes, sure. Let's do it then. So the question is, who is buried here? Alashar Khan? Yes, according to the legends, initially it was his grave, but today we can see 4 burials here. The main grave is in the center. What did they find here? During the excavation, they found the skeleton of an old man. No accessories were discovered in the grave. I guess no traces of Tengriist or steppe tradition were found. Oh no, it was a purely Muslim-style grave. Nevertheless, the mausoleum of Alashar Khan cannot be considered an exclusively Muslim monument. Some elements of the building themselves demonstrate the continuity of funeral ceremonies from the Bronze to the Middle Ages. First of all, it is the roundabout gallery, rather characteristic for Bronze Age cult buildings. Second of all, another interesting artifact discovered in the mausoleum is the imprint of the wolf's paw left by the architects in the mausoleum's interior. It is a well-known fact that wolves were the totem of Turkic peoples. So it is a rather interesting, seemingly Islamic building with certain elements strange for Islam. Totemism and animal-based style. All this is inherent in the steppe tradition. Yes, it appears as a symbiosis of Islamic and steppe cultures. Let's have a look inside. Watch your head. It's a pretty cramped room. Oh, what a panorama! Yes, an excellent view of the steppe, and you can see quite far. So, by tradition, one had to go around the building following the gallery. Did we already do it? In fact, we did, which means that we have performed a certain ritual. The ritual circle of the cycle of life and death closed. Having performed their pilgrimage to the graves of our ancestors, according to the ancient steppe tradition, the expedition team was eagerly returning home to see at last the faces of the people who fell into oblivion a long time ago and suddenly came back to life thanks to computer graphics. It turned out that the images of the recovered ancestors were almost ready. It was only necessary to finish some cosmetic procedures like texturing and toning the skin, highlighting the pores, planting the hair and so on. And right then, in front of our own eyes, the miracle of the computer age took place. The faces of our distant ancestors looked at us through and in defiance of thousands of years. Look at these faces. These people once lived in the same land where we live today. They grieved and rejoiced, dreamed of something and aspired to something. They had their ups and downs. They were the ones who had created the foundation of the way of life we lead now. They left this world a long time ago and now look at us as if asking a silent question through the millennia. What did you create? What will be your personal legacy? Because time will come and you will also go on the final journey along the paths of the other world. Over time, a lot of things change in life, but many things also remain unchanged. The invisible thread of the most ancient tradition connecting all of us. Nobody knows how they will bury our descendants in 1,000 years. Yet, one thing is clear. Some of the elements of this ancient rite will undoubtedly refer to us.